If you are going to mix your own potting mix, the most important thing to remember is to wear a mask. In this video, I am using peat moss, and this is not a sponsored video by any product that I am using. I'm only showing this for demonstration purposes. I will only be using half of this bag of the peat moss, so I'm cutting it high at the top to get the peat moss out. This particular bag of peat moss is 2.2 cubic feet. You can choose to use coco coir in place of peat moss if you feel it's a better choice. However, getting a hold of coco coir in my area, they only really sell it in small itty bitty bricks from what I've seen. Coco coir is sold in my area as seed starting mix in 8-quart bricks. It actually took me a long time to find coco coir in my area because I was looking for a package that said coco coir, but no, it says seed starting mix on a brick. When using coco coir, I've noticed it's a lot less dusty, but when you're using the peat moss, it's very important, like I said, to wear a mask. Some of the other materials that I'll be using to mix my own potting mix are also dusty as well, and the perlite, for one, seems to be the dustiest of them all. If you can tell, I'm actually using a kiddie pool to mix my potting mix. And I actually didn't purchase this kiddie pool. It was busted and being thrown out by one of my neighbors. So it definitely has drainage, which makes it easier to mix the water into the peat moss. If you do not have anything as large to mix your potting mix, you may have to make it in a smaller batch. Even the kiddie pool that I'm using isn't large enough to mix the entire product that I have. I did use approximately 1 cubic foot of peat moss in this kiddie pool, and to measure it, I filled half the kiddie pool up because I'm going to be using half peat moss, half compost, and approximately 0.75 cubic feet of perlite. Often when people make homemade potting mix, they often add garden lime. So there's claims that garden lime actually raises the pH of your soil. There's claims that peat moss is actually acidic, and when you're making your own potting mix and using peat moss, it's going to throw off your pH. However, I've been making homemade potting mix, not adding horticultural lime, and I have absolutely encountered no problems at all with my pH level for the crops that I grow. I do always add finely ground eggshells to my mix, though they say, and I'm not sure, that ground eggshells do not change the pH of your soil. Is it true? I don't know. Another important step that I'm going to mention is always bake your eggshells before grinding them in a blender. Baking eggshells before grinding them in the blender is supposed to reduce any risk of harmful pathogens such as salmonella entering your potting mix. Another thing that's important to mention is always wear a mask when you're grinding your eggshells because it does create a dust that is not safe for your lungs. Any added protection you can give yourself with a mask or even a respirator is helpful. There are also claims that adding ground eggshells to your garden does not prevent blossom end rot within 6 months. However, I've been doing this for a long time. I actually forgot to put ground eggshells in my potting mix once and noticed I was getting a black spot on my watermelon. And yes, watermelon can get blossom end rot. As soon as I saw the black spot on the watermelon, I did add the ground eggshells and it stopped. And to be honest, I do not get blossom end rot on my tomatoes, and I honestly believe it's because I add the ground eggshells. I've also heard that adding vinegar to your ground eggshells or something to that nature can actually make the calcium in the eggshell more rapidly available for your plants. I've actually not tried the vinegar method to the eggshells, and I don't even know how to tell you to do it. I haven't needed to, so I haven't done it. So I am using a small car snow shovel to mix the water into the peat moss. And if you notice, I'm not wearing any gloves or any protection for my hands while mixing this mix. It's actually important to wear protection for your hands when making homemade potting mix, especially if you're adding any manures. Anytime when working in the garden and you're dealing even with the soil in the ground, you should be wearing gloves. There can actually be harmful pathogens in the soil, and even ringworm. You walk outside barefoot, you're putting yourself at risk to get ringworm. However, I can't give medical advice because I'm not a doctor. Yeah, that is actually just some friendly advice. So while mixing this peat moss with the water, I have used about 5 gallons of water. You may actually need more or less water depending on how much drainage you have in your mixing tub or if you have any drainage at all. So as I was mentioning earlier about not wearing gloves, I only touch the peat moss while making this potting mix. I do not actually put my hands in this once the manure is added, but I'm gonna tell you right now, that's just an excuse. I should still be wearing gloves. The dog you see in the background, that's Mr. Bubs, and yeah, he actually does like to sit on people and Zelda, the white dog. I guess he's taking the whole lap dog to the extreme there. When you're mixing the water into your peat moss, you're still looking for the mixture to be crumbly, not watery at all. When you squeeze the peat moss with your hands, you shouldn't be having water coming out. And again, I really want to stress that I've made this potting mix more than once. And like I said, I have not added any horticultural garden lime. Horticultural garden lime is actually a product that I don't even carry, and I've been gardening for years. Though I do want to mention when your pH is off, you're going to notice some nutrient deficiencies in your plant. Regardless that I'm adding some compost and manure into this mix, I'm still going to want to regularly feed my tomatoes or whatever crop I'm growing with a good fertilizer. And also, when I add my compost and manure, I'm actually not making my own composted manure. I do have a compost bin. But at the moment, I actually don't have any compost available for this product. And it would actually have saved me maybe $5 if I did. So if you noticed, I poured the eggshells as close as possible to the mix. Then I actually covered it with some moistened peat moss to prevent any more eggshell dust from flying around. At no point of mixing this potting mix did I take off my mask either. At this point, there's really not that much dry spots on the peat moss, so I'm pushing it over so I can see that I'm adding approximately 50% peat moss and approximately 50% compost and manure. So the measurements of 50-50 is not 100% accurate when I'm making this mix, though it's pretty close. So like I said, that's approximately 1 cubic foot of peat moss. And then I'm also adding 1.5 cubic feet of compost and manure. The bags of compost and manure that I'm using are 0.75 cubic feet each. If you are using your own compost and you don't know how to measure the cubic feet, just keep it off to the side in your mixing tub and you can pretty much eyeball half and half. Just some really quick information if you don't already know. The majority of animal manures cannot be added fresh to the garden. The majority of animal manures have to be safely composted before using animal manure in your garden. Most animal manures are considered hot manures and they can contain harmful pathogens and even burn your plants when added directly to a garden. Though when making homemade compost, you do not necessarily have to have any type of manure in your compost for it to be full of nutrients for your plants. I actually found a weed in my compost mix, which typically doesn't happen, but it can. So far, I've opened 2 bags of 0.75 cubic feet of composted manure, which is 1.5 cubic feet, and I also use 1 cubic foot of peat moss. So now that I have approximately 50 peat moss and 50 compost and manure, I am going to stir it all in, and let's not forget the eggshells. I probably added a half a cup, and I could have used some more, maybe. Yeah, we'll see later. So honestly, I just stirred it a little bit, but it's not necessary to give it a good stir yet because I still have to add the perlites. The perlite product that I'm using is approximately 1.5 cubic foot. Though I'm only going to be using approximately half of this package, and at the end, the mix does look a little bit like it could have used maybe a little less perlite, though it's still good. In my opinion, too much perlite, a little bit too much, is a lot better than not having enough perlite, because when you don't have enough perlite, your mix is not going to be well draining at all. And as I mentioned earlier, the perlite is probably the dustiest ingredient that I'm adding. You can actually see the dust flying in the air, which is really important to remember. Wear a mask And if you have one, even wear a painter's respirator. Wearing a full face respirator is not exactly important, but a respirator would help. I feel like I go through a lot of potting mix year after year. Regardless, I have tried throwing it in the compost bin and storing it. It's just, I go through a lot of potting mix. I am growing a few crops in ground that do not require potting mix. However, a lot of my plants are container grown. Just in case you're asking why I put myself through this, knowing that these dusts are not good for my lungs. Mixing my own mix is actually saving me quite a bit of money, and even when you're handling regular potting mix, it can become dusty and pose a problem with your lungs. I'm actually going to be using this mix to make some potted plants for the top of my chicken coop. I'm also going to be potting up 2 mulberry trees that are dwarf. I'm also going to be potting up some dwarf blackberry vines. The roots are starting to come out the bottom of the container, which is a good indication it's time to pot them up. I also have to pot up some lemongrass and a few other things in the garden that I'm definitely going to need some potting mix for. I'm in zone 5B, so growing mulberry trees in a container just seems like a better idea. It's also said that mulberry trees have an invasive root system. And with that being said, you definitely don't want to plant a mulberry tree by the foundation of your house or near any underground things such as sewage systems. I'm also growing a lot of things in a container and storing them indoors over winter. One of the things that I grow in a container and store over winter indoors is a super dwarf Cavendish banana plant. I'm also growing a mini dwarf multi-grafted peach and nectarine tree in a container. The mini dwarf multi-grafted peach and nectarine tree is actually meant for zones 6 through 9. Although the peach tree is meant for zones 6 to 9, I'd imagine that it still requires chill hours, and I'm not bringing it inside a heated environment. I actually store it in an unheated shed. This is the second year that I've had the peach tree living in a container, and so far it's doing quite well. So let's just speed up this video a little bit. So now that we've made this potting mix and mixed it all up and talked about some of the things that I use this potting mix for. This was A-Hole Gardener reminding you that a great garden typically starts with a hole. So if you haven't already, hit that like and subscribe button.